This is the Deal Room, part of the Endgame, Israel's tech M&A podcast. This is a bite-sized English roundup of the last month in Israeli tech deals. I'm your host, Sophia Tupolev, working in deal communications. We're here with my esteemed co-host and serial exited entrepreneur, venture capitalist, and deal commentator par excellence, Zevi Michel. Zevi, take it away.
Thank you, Sophie, and it's awesome to be here again. Just a reminder to our listeners, this is a new type of segment we're trying where we're going to cover the monthly deals in Israel in the tech. Our main show is the Endgame, the Tech M&A podcast, where we're creating educational content, evergreen, hopefully, for entrepreneurs in Israel, but also around the world with C-levels and managements in order for them to know what is it they need to take care of when they're planning their journey of becoming entrepreneurs with the eyes of the end game. We bring shadow players, different parties that help or break deals, like the lawyers and the accountants and corporate developments and the investment bankers, etc. So I urge you all to go and follow us on LinkedIn, Apple Music, Spotify, and whatnot. Enjoy that content as well.
I love it. You're getting really good at promoting the shows, Evie.
Thank
It's
you.
growing thanks to your marketing skills. That's all I can say. Awesome. So let's get into it. 10 Israeli deals in May 2025 and two public offerings, one that you definitely heard about and one that you may not have heard about. We'll get into why that one was a little bit not standard, but also very cool. Serial Israeli acquirer Tenable. I always feel like I'm saying serial killer when I say serial acquirer. Serial Israeli acquirer Tenable with its second acquisition this year, earlier Vulcan and now Apex for 100 million. Now, they've bought more than two companies, right, Tenable?
Yes. So again, Tenable, very good example. American giant, cyber giant, really understanding and let's say double dipping on the Israeli market, whatever the word is. This is their sixth, I think, or seven acquisition in the last 2 to 3
Wow.
years here in Israel. We had an episode talking about the importance of having an acquirer who already has made deals in Israel versus somebody who's completely green about this. It adds to the complexity of the process, while if the company is already familiar with what's going on here from a taxation, legal, Ramadan, the grants that you get from the government, etc. This makes life much easier. So I think Tenable at this point, probably one of the more advanced American companies of doing acquisitions here. Again, putting aside the giants, the Googles, the Microsoft that's been doing acquisitions here for tens of years now. But indeed, a very interesting piece.
Amazing. And also, there is a big one with Checkpoint buying Verity. Can you say a couple words about that?
Sure. So again, going back more on the high level, as Sophie said, 10 deals. I think the majority of the deals were cyber related, AI related, all by strategics. Here's a good example of a Israeli by Israeli actions, Checkpoint, although obviously being traded in the US, it's an Israeli shop making their acquisition of Verity. The interesting point, at least to notice for the entrepreneurs, this was relatively a short journey, 2 years, 3 years that the company's been around, reportedly only raising less than $10 million. dollars. I think it was $8 million. dollars. So if the numbers are correct and if all the accounts are right, then I'm assuming it was a very lucrative deal both for the founders, the early stage investors, and Checkpoint as well, probably getting the type of talent and technology they were sought after. So very interesting. But again, look at the dynamics. An Israeli strategic, very short period of time. I found it to be very interesting.
Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, I think last month when we did our show in May, we talked about the first half of the year and we saw about 23 deals, half of which were Israeli startups buying other startups. We were talking about, wow, startup on startup M&A. We're maturing as an industry. We're kind of patting ourselves on the back. This month, actually, what you're saying is we're seeing a lot of strategics. It's all
Yes.
strategics, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
again, the definition of strategics, we keep on discussing about
Yeah.
this. Obviously, with all the respect to Tenable, we can't really say Tenable is in the same league as Microsoft or Google, right? So again, this is just different ballparks in valuations and size, etc. But indeed, I think we see less of the clear startups like we saw in the first episode we did that covered the first 4 months of 2025. You can argue Orca is somewhat of a startup scale up. Although being valued at over $1 billion, they acquired Opus. Another cyber on cyber deal, Israeli on Israeli deal. The numbers again was not really reported, tens of millions, probably something in that range, maybe less, maybe more. But I
Yeah.
think yes, we see majority Red Hat obviously being a strategic. Fortinet again very big. Yeah.
Wix, I would even say Wix is strategic at this point. I mean, they're huge, right?
We
So
they're in their world, obviously, huge company, strategic as it gets. Obviously, traded in the U.S. market, publicly
yeah,
traded market. I think
yeah,
this acquisition. Sometimes we see some weird things. So again, giant companies acquiring companies with 10 people or 20 people. The amounts are not reported. If you're trading at 10 billion, 20 billion. It might be the question, why are you acquiring relatively such a small company? I'm sure they had their own reasons and it
yeah.
fits really into their playbook of products they want to offer, etc. But again, I think our one in a way fits under the category of AI capabilities and skill sets that probably a lot of the strategics are trying to beef up as quickly as possible. So sometimes they will opt to acquire the companies for the product or the capabilities rather than building it internally.
Yeah, and speaking of larger Israeli companies that I personally put in the category of strategics, we saw Perion, which is an established, one of the legacy Israeli startups, I think founded in 1999. They are dual listed on NASDAQ and the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. They acquired a French startup for custom algorithms. I think that's your neck of the woods. Maybe you can talk about the rationale in that deal as well.
Yep. So Perion obviously being strategic, publicly trading. The ad tech, the advertising tech world is pretty unique. It has its own dynamics. Most of those companies, if not all those companies, are profitable. That's the business. So it's very different than the typical, let's say, VC route, cyber route, AI route. I think a lot of those companies, most of the time, are not necessarily VC backed. Although in this example, Perion acquired a French outlet called Greenbids. Just by chance, it's part of our portfolio at Alaya. So
Nice.
thank you. But what Greenbids is doing is actually ESG reports around the ad tech world. So that's also the reason why it was VC backed. And I think for Perion, this is a very good complementary to their existing offering, especially if you want to cater more to the European market where regulations and the ESG space is extremely developed in Europe
Yeah,
globally.
I hate to talk about identity politics, but there were two acquisitions in May that I think are significant for a different reason. Fortinet acquired Surrey Data, and that's a company with a woman in the CEO seat. That's in a landscape where 1 in 10 Israeli startups, only 10% of startups are managed by women. That's something that was reported by Globes the other week. And there was another acquisition where Keep was acquired by a company called Elastic, and of one of the three founders is actually an Ole Hadash, a new immigrant to Israel that came in the last 3 years. So, and it's his second acquisition as a founder. So those two made me very happy to see that, all different kinds of people. Like, I never like to go to events that are like all about women or all about something, because it's like at the end of the day, it's about the business.
We need to encourage the awareness of things like
Yeah,
that.
I think that once you see more women getting acquired, more Olim getting acquired, more people from other peripheral communities that are not the typical tech founder, maslul that happens, the track that happens here, it's actually a sign of maturity in our industry. So I think that's a really beautiful thing. In some other deals that we signed, and we mentioned the Tenable deal with Apex for 100, Checkpoint with Verity for another 100. We talked about Perion, we talked about Fortnite. We actually covered most of them. There was actually a big one with Key Factor acquiring InfoSec Global, undisclosed, but said hundreds of millions, which is kind of cool. And there was actually two things. We had two IPOs. So obviously you had eToro. You can talk about that. And then there was another one that happened here on the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Can
Yep.
you give us some context, Debbie?
Sure. So first of all, let's congratulate the eToro founders and
Yeah,
management
well
team.
deserved.
Well deserved 17 years of a very long journey. From starting a company. 17 years in the tech world seems like, who remembers what was 17 years ago, which computer we used or which phone did we use. So
Yeah.
amazing, company's been around and did very well, raised a significant amount of money from the traditional track of VCs, etc. But again, to me, this is just a testament of grit, hard work, 17 years of a very long journey to get to a point where people believe once you IPOing, that's it. But actually, once you IPO, it's just another chapter. So for congrats to everybody. And again, just for our listeners, IPO is definitely a part of a potential end game that you might aspire, you might strive towards. But again, normally this is a minimum 10-year journey, if not more. And again, eToro proves 17 years in the making. I think the other IPO we had is quite interesting because it's somewhat of a Israeli version of a SPAC. Again, for the audience, let's be very clear, this is not a typical SPAC as you would see in New York, in the NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange. So SPAC, very quickly, special purpose vehicle in order to basically put new companies into the stock exchange in a fast track. Was very hyped during COVID. We saw a lot of companies entering the market through that. The Israeli stock exchange doesn't really have the same mechanism. According to what we have in the Israeli stock exchange market is not really a spec per se, but rather a reverse merger, where what we do is we take a company that's already listed, but its substance or its assets are basically depleting, and then you're looking for a private company to basically acquire and put the assets and all the activity within that. So I think that's what happened with gene mergers of Micronet. Micronet was already publicly trading, but with very low assets, and then they merged. Now again, this is not a typical endgame for most tech Israeli companies. This is pretty unique. I think during the hype of the spec, the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange tried to have its own version for small cap companies. Didn't really work out, but
Yeah, I actually worked for one of the few companies that it did work out for, but most of them it didn't work out
true. But
in
yet again,
2021.
to me, it's amazing. We see different types of end games. We see different types of structures. We see different types of buying mechanisms. Again, we didn't talk that much about the different mechanisms of the acquisitions that we saw. Some of them are pure cash. Some of them are a combination of cash and stock. Some of them are based on certain milestones reached with earnouts, etc. As we are talking again and again in the end game in our main show, these are all the types of things that entrepreneurs need to be aware of, they need to know about, and understand that some of the decisions they're taking along the way might impact the end of the journey. So I think,
Yeah.
yet again, this is a very good month, a very representable month for the Israeli tech M&A scene.
Yeah, and we already saw one deal reported in June, so we'll be talking about that next month. I think that's fantastic, Zevi. Thank you so much. That's a wrap for the month. We'll see you next time talking about June deals, June deal activity. We closed out May with, we said 10 M&As and 2 public offerings, which is fantastic. That makes it 12, I guess. You could, if you count the IPOs. Send this show to a founder friend. Go follow our page on LinkedIn for all the deal trash talk that you can handle. And thank you so much for joining us for another fantastic episode of the Monthly Deal Room. See
Thank
you
you
next
very
time.
much.